All right. So I think we can get started. We're just over the hour. So first off, thank you everybody for being here today. I think this is one of the largest Zoom sessions we've had for the documentation webinars with everyone showing up at the same time. So great to see you all. I can't wait to learn more about your work, your communities, where you're calling from towards the end in the question session. And I'm just going to dive right into sharing my screen. Right, and hopefully everybody can see this. All right, so I am now going to be looking mostly at this PowerPoint. So if anything comes up and you see anything urgent in the chat, Akao, will you just like hop on the mic and ping me? And other than that, we'll just go ahead and get started. So first off, welcome. This is session one of the 2023 ELP language documentation webinars, and we're so happy you're here. This is really one of my favorite things we do at the Endangered Languages Project. I love getting to learn with y'all every year, so delighted that you're joining us. So this is an 8-week online learning series where every Friday at this time, we're going to get together on Zoom and learn about a different topic in language documentation. And each workshop will be led by a different person, often a graduate student or recent graduate in language documentation. And I believe on week 7, Akao, our wonderful moderator today, is going to be teaching Elan, the documentation software. So stay tuned for that. And I know that we're all joining from all different places all around the world, but I'd just like to take a second to acknowledge the land I'm on. So I'm here as a settler on the traditional territories of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and lots of other peoples who have lived and cared for this land where I am now, in the city called Portland, Oregon. And this is where Chinook Wawa is still spoken, and many other languages are also being revitalized. So I'm honored to be talking to you from this land where I am. And I guess I ought to introduce myself a little further. So, hi, everyone. I'm Anna Ballou. I'm the program manager at the Endangered Languages Project. And I'm also an adjunct assistant professor of linguistics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So the documentation learning that I'm going to be sharing with you today is very much coming from my own background in this field. So what I've learned about documentation may be a little bit different than what other people have learned. I started out at Boston University under Kathy O'Connor, who was trained at Berkeley. And then I did my PhD at the University of Hawaii. And most of my language documentation work has been in Cameroon with mostly a language called Yasa, spoken in South Cameroon. But I have also gotten to learn a lot about Majumba, spoken in West Cameroon. So me in a nutshell, I'm kind of from this American school of language documentation, and I have mostly worked in Cameroon. And so technical stuff about this webinar real quick. We are recording this session. And so if there's anything you want to go back and listen to again, we're going to post all the recordings on both our Facebook group and the YouTube page for the Endangered Languages Project. And there might be a little bit of lag, hopefully less so on Zoom, but if I don't see your question and immediately answer, I'm not ignoring you. I might just not have seen it yet. And if you have any technical problems while we're doing this stream, let us know, comment in the chat or tag Akao Johnson, and we'll try and help you out. One administrative question we often get, will you receive a certificate for completing this webinar? Yes. Anybody who attends most of the live webinar sessions will receive a certificate. So I have automatic tracking of who comes to which sessions through Zoom, and you'll automatically be sent a certificate. If you're not able to join the live sessions, but you've been following along and you would like a certificate, email me and we can do that. And one last thing, I know I can talk very fast sometimes, and I have a really strong American accent. So if you would like me to talk slower or say things a little more clearly, just let me know. I'll slow down. All right. So, pop quiz. How many languages do y'all think exist in the world? We get some guesses in the chat. Ah, I love this question because the first year we did this webinar, people were like, I don't know, 3,200. But this year in 2023, basically everyone's like 7,000. I think the word has gotten around that our best guess is about 7,000 languages in the world. And of course, there are some problems with that number. It's not exact, but it's the best guess that we have right now. And most of the languages that exist in the whole world are spoken by pretty small populations of people, right? There are some really big languages spoken by lots of folks, but most languages that are out there have pretty small speaker populations. It's actually pretty normal to have a small speaker population. And it doesn't mean that a language is endangered if it has a small speaker population, but that means we have to unpack what it means for a language to be quote unquote endangered. And first off, I want to say that not everyone wants to use this term endangered. There are a lot of real issues with framing language vitality and language use in this kind of biological metaphor that we use for endangered species. Why is that a problem? Why is it complicated? That's a really long discussion, and we talked about it in a previous webinar for advanced language documentation. So if you're interested in this issue of how we talk about endangered languages, the words we use, the framing we use, I would encourage y'all to check out the recording of the advanced webinar. I'll post a link after this session. But for the purposes of today, if we want to simplify it, if we say that a language is endangered, it means that pretty much there is a risk that it won't be spoken by anybody anymore within maybe a few generations. And this thing where a language stops having any speakers has happened a lot in recent history, a lot. Hundreds of languages that we know of have been silenced just in the last 60 or so years. And language endangerment and language loss are happening faster and more prevalently right now than at any time in all of known human history. Right? Let that sink in. Languages are being silenced faster and more broadly right now than ever before in all of human history, as far as we know. So it's pretty urgent. And if we look at just, again, these numbers, about 46%, almost half of all languages in the entire world are currently endangered. And this is from ELP's own catalog of endangered languages. This is a research project based at the University of Hawaii. And if we look at these statistics, they are sobering. They're kind of scary. The question then is why? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing so much language loss all over the world right now? Well, first thing we got to get out of the way is that it has nothing to do with the languages themselves. It is not at all related to anything about the language being too complicated. You'll hear this sometimes like, this language is too hard to learn, and that's why it's endangered. Similarly, there's no such thing as a language that's too simple. All languages, from a linguistic point of view, have about the same ability to describe the world in ways that people need to describe the world. Some languages might have more sounds or interesting grammatical features, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to say that a language is more complicated than another language. And I see in the chat, sorry, I see about this doorbell tone when people are coming in or out. I don't know if I can change that setting while we are on the call. I'm sorry. It is very annoying. Let me see if I can turn it off right now. I don't think so, but I will remember to turn that off for the next one so we don't have to hear the doorbell every time someone comes in. But all right, back to why languages become endangered. Again, it's not about a language being too hard to learn because any human baby can learn any human language. It's just part of how we're built, right? Any kid can learn any language. There's no language that's too complicated for a kid to learn. Another thing you'll sometimes hear is that a language is endangered because it's not logical enough, because you can't use it for science, or it's not beautiful enough, or something like that. And as a linguist, I will tell you, this is nonsense. No language is inherently more beautiful than another. That's just an aesthetic judgment that people have. There's nothing truly linguistically sound about that. Similarly, all languages can be used logically. And this kind of ties into something you'll often hear, that X language is not fit for the modern world. It's too old fashioned. It's too ancient to be used in the modern world. And again, this just isn't true. Every language changes over time. Every language can devise new words for stuff that's invented or that people find out about, right? English didn't have a word for email 50 years ago. We made one up. Just like that, every language can change and grow and adapt to new things in the world. So there's no such thing as a primitive language. There's no such thing as a language that doesn't work in the modern world. That's just racist nonsense. So what I'm trying to tell y'all is that there's nothing inside a language itself that causes it to become endangered. So if it's not about the language, what does cause language endangerment? Well, language endangerment is a social issue. It's a social, political, human society issue. And the things that cause language endangerment are things that affect the people who speak a language or sign a language for sign languages, right? It's all about stuff that is happening to human beings. All right, just checking the chat real quick. Oh, got some more introductions. Hello to everybody who's just joined. Thanks for being here. So if we get into the broad categories of things that cause language endangerment, I'm going to try and break them down into a few groups of things. But again, this stuff's very messy, very complex. It's hard to say very simply like, oh, X, Y, and Z have caused this language to be endangered. But let's take a very general overview here. So there's what some linguists might call physical factors, things that happen to the people who use the language. And this is often what you might call the really bad stuff that happens in the world. So genocide, conflict, war, diseases, natural disasters, colonialism, forced cultural disruption, right? Forced assimilation, all of the awful things that human beings do to one another, especially under colonial systems. Language oppression is really common, and overt, violent language oppression has happened a lot all over the world. So, this really bad stuff that harms human beings directly, this is one of the biggest, nastiest underlying causes of language endangerment. And this is true in really a lot of language endangerment contexts. Maybe not every single one, but a lot of them. And another thing you'll often see when language endangerment happens is that people are under some kind of economic survival pressure, right? People are having to go somewhere else because they can't make a living anymore in their original home, or maybe where they live is becoming a city and changing really fast. Maybe people's traditional lands can no longer support the way they were surviving there before, right? Let's say you're a fisherman, the water gets polluted, you can't stay in your land and fish anymore because the water's polluted. So things that happen to people's lands and make them have to go somewhere else to make a living. And this also includes things like, well, I have to get a desk job to make a decent living, and I can only use French in the office, right? These kinds of economic pressures are often woven really closely with language endangerment. And so, things like gotta make money at the market, gotta migrate to a city, right? These are very, very common factors. And then, kind of tied to the really bad stuff category, we have ongoing sort of political and legal suppression of some languages. Sometimes it might actually be illegal to use your language in some contexts or even in entire countries. Sometimes there are government policies that really make it hard or dangerous to use your language. Sometimes it's just sort of stigma, right? Sometimes it's, well, there's this big message that if you use this language, you're not very smart. That kind of stuff can be very common. Sometimes it's simply that there's no funding to develop education in your language, right? The government doesn't think your language is important enough to have its own schools or its own medical services or use in a courtroom. So these are all generally, they fall under violations of language rights or political repression. And these are really common contexts all over the world. So at the bottom here, you'll see an English only zone sign. You might see these all over the United States, places where people try and prevent folks from using any language other than English. Similarly, in Russia, there was a well-known case a few years ago where an Udmurt scholar, which is one of the indigenous languages of Russia, actually committed suicide in front of a Russian government building because there was no longer going to be education in his language, and this was going to really harm the language's prospects. So political repression can be a huge factor in language endangerment. And then we get into the more complicated, hard to quantify stuff that happens around people's feelings and people's choices and people's attitudes. And we talked a minute ago kind of about stigma, right? About there being bad stereotypes about people who use a language. And this can really filter into ordinary people's lives, right? It's very common to hear parents say things like, well, I'm going to raise my kid in the dominant language so they have a chance to really be somebody when they grow up, so that they can have a good job or live in a nice house or whatever aspirations they have for their kids. People sometimes really internalize this idea and maybe reality that you have to use the dominant language to have a good future. And so this ties into stuff like shame about speaking a language, or maybe on the other side, pride in using the language. And if any of you have issues like this in your community, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. Like, oh, people think that our language is for rural people or for old people, or whatever it is that you feel might be driving language endangerment in your context. We'd love to hear about it. But it's never as simple as there's just one thing going on, right? Language endangerment being a social issue is as complicated as all social issues are. And so almost always you find a mixture of these different kinds of factors. There's almost always something economic, something attitudinal, some sort of legal or political dimension, some sort of traumatic history or ongoing trauma. There's always multiple things happening when you find language endangerment. And that leads us to a couple of important points that it's important, at least in my opinion, not to blame people or communities for shifting away from their languages. Sometimes you see articles or people saying things like, well, if you really cared about your language, you wouldn't let it die, right? There's a lot of victim blaming that can happen when people are shifting to another language. But I want to say that even when it looks like a free choice that people are moving to another language, it's usually not because they have a lot of other options, right? If a language is becoming endangered, it's usually because the people who speak that language are under enormous pressure of some kind. And if they're being forced to choose between maintaining their language or keeping their kids healthy and safe and fed, is that really a choice? Is that really a free choice? I think there's usually some degree of coercion or injustice or oppressive pressure happening to people when they choose to change languages and to let go of their existing language. But again, this is a really complicated issue. You probably have different perspectives and different experiences. So, really encourage y'all to discuss it respectfully amongst yourselves and share your own experience here. But in general, from what I've seen from working in this field for a decade plus, is that language endangerment just doesn't happen when things are going okay for people. It's not something that occurs when people are stable and thriving and doing well. So there's a Chickasaw scholar, a linguistic anthropologist named Jenny L. Davis, and the way she put it is really concise. She says language endangerment is tied to the decline or demise of indigenous sovereignty or autonomy. It's tied to the loss of political, economic, or geographic stability and power, right? If we unpack that, it means that people no longer have the ability to shape their own lives the way they used to. They may have lost their relationship or ownership or ability to stay on their land. They may have been marginalized economically. And then she goes on to say that there's a strong correspondence of language attrition, right? That is language shift, language loss, language endangerment, with the actual necropolitical dynamics in marginalized communities. And now we're getting into like very jargony academic talk, but when we talk about necropolitics, we talk about the systems that produce death in the world, right? The things that harm people, the things that cause suffering and death. And when you find language endangerment, you often find it tied to lots of these other things that produce human suffering and death. And I know we're getting pretty heavy. Language endangerment is a heavy, heavy topic. And we're going to move past all of this really doom and gloomy stuff here in a second to talk about solutions. But I just want to take a second to acknowledge that when we talk about language endangerment, it's not just about like, oh, I found a new language to use and it's cool and I like it and it sounds nice. No, when we're talking about language endangerment, it's about really hard, difficult, sad things that are happening to human beings. And we should keep that in mind no matter what we're doing with language documentation. All right, on to the positives. Let's talk a little bit about this notion of how we classify endangered languages. That's not necessarily a positive, but it's good for reference. So when we talk about a language being endangered, it's not really just a yes/no question, right? It's not just, is this language endangered or is it just fine? There's stuff in the middle there. So it's kind of like a scale in the way that scholars try to quantify it. They try and sort it into little categories. So if we do that, then at the very most serious end, we have languages that are dormant, right? Which means languages that don't have any living speakers anymore. Everyone who knew that language has passed. And so you find dormant languages all over the world, like Kakadu in Australia. When we get to the critically endangered zone, this is a label that usually applies to languages that have just a few speakers, often just a few elders, a small number, maybe less than 10 or 20 speakers. That's what linguists call critically endangered. And then in the middle, we have a label, what we call threatened. And this refers to languages that do still have a pretty decent speech community. People still use it and learn it, but that's changing, right? There are becoming fewer and fewer speakers. Children maybe aren't learning the language as much anymore. People aren't using the language as much in their daily life. So one example of that would be Iasa, the language I work with in Cameroon, maybe about 2,000 people who speak it, which is a lot compared to some languages maybe in North America or Australia, but not that many compared to bigger languages. So this is kind of a middle level of language endangerment. And then at sort of the less extreme end, we have languages that are doing pretty good right now, but things might be changing and they might be declining really slowly. Like Sasak in Indonesia, it has about 2 million speakers. And you might think, well, language that big can't be endangered. But even if you have 2 million speakers, if kids aren't learning the language so much anymore, then you're sort of looking at a ticking time bomb for when nobody knows the language anymore, right? Because kids are the ones who are going to carry it forward to future generations. So if things are being disrupted, even with a big language, it can become endangered over time. And again, I want to take a second and say there are definitely problems with trying to quantify or put numbers or categories on something as complicated as language vitality, right? This is a human issue. It's hard to sort human beings into little boxes, and there are a lot of problems with doing that. So I will put some readings about the notion of numbers and language vitality in the Facebook group. It's good stuff to think about. And I'm going to take a pause to check the chat in case there are any questions to address on this part. Yeah, Yumi, I see your comment that there's a lot of generational trauma and shame and economic factors that affect your community in speaking your language. Yeah, this is really, really common that all of this stuff gets kind of woven together. Jabrilla, I see your comment. I love hearing about why people feel shy to speak their language. Yeah, it's true that when the language community has some economic problems or has some aspect of culture that people frown upon, they won't feel comfortable speaking their language in cities or public places. Yeah, this is so common. Um, people people have attitudes towards language that are almost always really attitudes about the people who speak that language, right? So if you hear, I don't like hearing this language, what that person is really saying is, I don't really like the people who speak this language. And that's a whole aspect of sociolinguistic studies that I'd love to talk to y'all more about. But I see some requests for the Facebook page. I'm going to drop that in the chat real quick. We will move along to the next session. All right, there is the link to the Facebook group. And yeah, I see a comment from Renard that the sociolinguistic issue is real. We surveyed a community in Papua where they're not aware that their language is endangered. Yeah, when things are hard for a community, language might not be the first thing on their minds, right? If you're just trying to stay alive and stay safe and find your next meal, you're probably not thinking about language endangerment. But again, this is one of the reasons that language endangerment and hard times are so closely woven together. When language endangerment is happening, people usually have other priorities, not doing something about language. So let's get into this question of like, why does it matter? I kind of hate addressing this question because I feel like we shouldn't even have to convince people that languages matter. And I hope that if you're here in this webinar, you are already with us in believing that languages matter. Languages matter. But maybe you'll have to convince other people in your life, right? Maybe you have friends or family members who are like, nah, I don't believe that languages matter. So here are some of the ways that they obviously do matter. Cultural and social and spiritual identity can be really, really closely tied to language, right? Some people might even say you're not a real member of our community if you don't speak the language. A lot of people experience a profound sense of identity loss when they're not able to learn or speak their language. Some folks believe that there are spiritual practices that can only be done in your language. And if you lose the language, you lose a lot of that connection. So there are so many aspects of who you are and how you fit in your community that are tied to language. And then there's the simple fact of health and well-being also being very closely related to language. There are tons of studies that show that in communities where the indigenous language is being maintained or revitalized, there are better health outcomes, lower rates of diabetes, better mental health, lower rates of suicide, better school graduation rates, all kinds of ways that people are just doing better when they are able to use and revitalize and keep their language strong. And if you're interested in those studies, if you need to convince some doubters, I'll share those as well in the Facebook group. There's the issue of human rights, right? It's a human right acknowledged by the United Nations for Indigenous people to use, transmit, and develop their own languages. This is in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so if you want to argue with the UN, go ahead, but it is sort of internationally agreed upon statute that you have the right to keep your language. There's also a very useful statement on understanding and defending language rights from the Global Coalition for Language Rights. It's available in like 30 languages or something. So go check that out if you want to learn more about language rights. There's also this aspect of quote unquote scientific knowledge. And this is one of the arguments you'll hear very often when people are talking about why language endangerment matters, right? Languages encode all sorts of knowledge that has been refined and transmitted and grown over generations. And this includes indigenous science, right? There's this artificial divide sort of between indigenous knowledge and quote unquote Western science. But really, indigenous sciences have so much knowledge built into the languages where this knowledge has developed that if that language goes away, a lot of that knowledge might also be lost. And that is important for our ability to grow food or make medicine or survive or thrive. There's also this issue of linguistic and cognitive science needing to understand how language works in order to develop any good theories of the human mind or the human ability to speak language. And so if linguistics were just based on the 10 biggest languages in the world, we would have a really poor understanding of the human linguistic faculty, right? It would be bad data and bad science. So selfishly, linguists want there to be lots of languages for us to study. And then, of course, there's arts and humanities. We're going to lose beautiful poetry and music and stories and ways of knowing and thinking if languages go away. So much is deeply tied to language. Like, sure, you can read, here's a silly example, but like, yeah, you can read Shakespeare in French, but is it the same? Are you really getting the same art as the guy wrote? I don't know. Similarly, a song that's been translated, maybe you get the literal meaning, but you lose a lot of the beauty that's in that original language. And more, right? I'm sure you can all think of additional ways that language matters to you, to your life, to your research, to your community. There are infinite ways that language is important to different people, but these are just some of the ways that you might explain it to other folks. And these are questions for y'all to think about. Why does your language matter to you? It's a big question. Maybe you're just like, because it does. But maybe you have some more specific reasons that are really important to you. And maybe those reasons are different from the people around you. Why does it matter to your auntie? Why does it matter to your son? Why does it matter to your best friend? Why does it matter to your neighbor across the country? And what parts of your language that really matter to you would you want to safeguard for the future? Because that is what language documentation is about, is recording parts of your language that you want to carry forward into the future. So I'm going to take a second to look in the chat. All right. Hi, everybody that has joined recently. I'm seeing, yes, it is important for your own healing and wellness to work with language. Absolutely. That's beautiful. And for your own identity. Yes. And I will definitely share some of the links of the studies for the relationship between languages and wellness. I will also save the questions that are a little bit more complicated for the end. So, Kyle, if you could, will you just keep track of the questions that are not answered in the chat and we'll come back to them? All right. So going forward, again, like I said, you can argue with the UN if you want to, but they declared this whole decade the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So through 2032, by the UN's declaration, this is a whole decade devoted to sustaining, documenting, revitalizing, promoting, advocating for Indigenous languages, and making sure that people can uphold and use their languages in all parts of their life. Hooray! And so, yeah, things are really challenging for languages right now. All over the world, things are rough. But there's good news. The good news is that not only is language endangerment happening more, but language revitalization is happening more. There are more people working to document and reclaim and support and uplift their languages all over the world. And these photos are just a small selection of friends and colleagues of ELP doing language work all over the world to keep languages strong. And so this webinar is about one of those things that people can do to keep languages strong, and that is language documentation. And if we go back to one of the papers that sort of started language documentation as a field of study, by Nicholas Himmelman, he defined this as creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. So what do we mean by lasting? Well, the idea is that these records are supposed to last a long time. They should be available in 10 years or 50 years or 200 years. They should be around for the future. And by multi-purpose record, he means a record that can be used for a lot of different things, whether it's creating teaching materials or learning about history or geography, or for linguists to learn about verb structures, whatever. The goal is for the records we make to be useful to a lot of different people at different points in the future, including right now, like tomorrow. So we'll get a little bit more into what we document and how and why in general. But first, again, maybe you're tired of my caveats here, but I want to say I'm going to be talking about language documentation from the training background I come from, which is Western US academia, right? I'm trained as a linguist. I did all this in US universities, but the way that I've been trained in language documentation is not the only one, and it's not the only real one. So there are many ways that you could do documentation in your community that might be different from what I'm talking about here. That's great. The most important thing is that you do language documentation in a way that makes sense for your context, for you, for your needs and your goals. All right. But we'll get back to the concrete stuff that we might suggest now. Yes, do what's right for you and your community. But in general, language documentation involves some basic stuff, right? So first off, it's about making recordings of lots of different aspects of a language and the way people use those languages. And that includes other languages that they might use, right? So let's say I'm doing a documentation project mostly for IASA, but a lot of people in the IASA community also speak Fang. So I might include recordings of Fang and IASA being used together. Why not? It's all about documenting what people really actually do in their language daily lives. And if you can, and this is not always easy to get, but you should use the best equipment that you can to make the highest quality recordings that you can, right? Maybe some of you have had the experience of like listening to old like magnetic tape recordings or even wax cylinder recordings, and it's not quite as clear or useful as like a new high definition audio recording. You might hear some static. It might be kind of hard to hear what people are saying. So we want the records we make to be as good quality as possible, even if that's just your cell phone, because that's the best thing you've got. We will teach you some tricks to make sure that the quality you get is as good as it can be. And another thing that's often involved in language documentation is keeping all of those recordings safe somewhere. So it might be an archive, it might be a library or a museum or a community center. But really, this is just about putting your recordings somewhere safe so that they don't vanish. We've all maybe heard stories about somebody who had like a big box of audio tapes with recordings that you could never make again because those people have passed on. And like they leave the box of tapes in their basement and it floods and all the tapes are destroyed. This is what we don't want to happen. We want to keep your recordings somewhere safe that they can't like get lost or burn down or whatever. And finally, one part of language documentation that you might want to do is studying the language and the way people use the language, whether that's like, oh, I want to hear how elders use this specific term so that I can teach it. Or maybe it's, I'm really interested in the way people pronounce this one thing, and I want to look at all my recordings and hear how people pronounce it. You could study all different aspects of a language using a good documentation. So you want to make it useful to lots of different kinds of people. Checking the chat one more time. I see some images being shared. Cool. Beautiful. All right, I'll check the chat a little more thoroughly towards the end. But when we ask, what do we want to document? There are some kind of standard things you might think of, right? Like probably if I ask you to raise your hand, if you think documentation involves making a dictionary, probably a lot of people would raise their hand, right? So yes, recording words and sentences and the meanings of those words and sentences is a really important part of documentation. But so is the ways people use language in their regular lives. So just conversations, even just like, oh, hey, I'm going to the store to buy coffee. That conversation between you and the cashier at the store could be a good piece of language documentation. Same thing with speeches, right? Maybe somebody's giving a speech at a big community event or performing a wedding or yelling at someone for making a mistake. All these things are great things to document with permission. Anything that people do with language is a good thing to document because, again, one of the overarching goals of language documentation is to make a good record of how people actually talk, of how people actually use language in their lives. So even if it doesn't seem important or serious, that doesn't mean you shouldn't record it. We don't all go around making formal speeches all day. We also tell jokes and argue with each other and give directions. All that is really crucial stuff in any language. So generally, if we're going to look at the toolkit for a basic language documentation, this is sort of the components you'll often find when people document a language. So usually you'll make a record of like what sounds are in a language, or if it's a sign language, what hand shapes are used. And this is the fancy term for this is phonology and phonetics. If we're dealing with sounds, we'll also usually record the words that are used in a language, even though it's almost impossible to record every single word in a language, right? There are thousands, but people try and gather as many words as they possibly can. They'll often also document the ways that words are formed, right? How pieces of words get put together to form a word, and how you turn, a noun into a verb or something like that. This is called morphology. We'll also usually document how you put words together to make a sentence. That's called syntax. And then as we get to bigger and bigger pieces, right? How do you put sentences together to turn into conversations or speeches or stories? And finally, you'll almost always include some actual examples of people using the language, right? So conversations, jokes, storytelling, speeches, anything like that. And in academic language documentation, these are often called texts, which is a little silly because usually they are not written. We're making video or audio recordings, but anything that's about actual language use, you might see it called a text. It's a very old school term. But then if you want to move beyond just like this basic level stuff, you can really get creative in what you focus on documenting. And again, I want to encourage you to think about what you find most important or interesting about your language and how people use your language. So these are just some samples of like actual studies I know of in language documentation. So things like in-law languages. I don't know if y'all have these in your communities, but sometimes there are rules for how you can talk to like your father-in-law or your mother-in-law. So you could document that. Sometimes maybe there's special vocabulary for hunting or reindeer herding or whatever else. So special vocabulary around an activity people do. You could look at different ways people talk in different villages or different age groups, right? You could look at the way people do song melodies if they interact with tone in your language. These are all real examples, and there are infinite more really interesting, cool topics that you could focus on in your documentation work. So think about what you're passionate about, what you find interesting, what you think is really important in your language. And I guarantee it's an interesting and great thing to document. So yeah, there's a lot that can be considered good language documentation, right? It's almost overwhelming to be faced with all these choices and think, oh my gosh, what should I document? And in a perfect world, by, in within the beliefs of language documentation, you should document all of it, everything, every single aspect of how people use language. But that's not really realistic. We don't have infinite time and recorder space. So the question is then, where do you start? What do you focus on? And how should I document my language? Well, the answer is you got to think about your goals for your language. And it's useful to kind of think about where you're trying to go in order to make decisions about what to document. So, just some examples. Maybe you might want to think about, who am I doing this documentation for, right? Who is my ideal audience? And again, the perfect documentation, in theory, has something for everyone, but that's hard to do. You're just a person. You need to focus. So maybe you want to create resources for learners who don't know the language yet, but they want to try and learn it. So that would shape your documentation focus. Maybe you want this to be for people in your community who already do speak the language, or maybe people in the future who know the language. Maybe you want this to be useful to researchers like linguists or anthropologists. Maybe you want this to be useful to other types of researchers like historians or biologists or climate scientists or whoever. Or who else? There are all kinds of people you could be trying to make documentation for. And again, it's up to you to decide on your priorities. But if we think about outcomes in addition to audiences, right? What are you trying to achieve when you make this documentation? Do you want this to turn into learning materials like a learner's grammar? Do you want this to turn into stuff for people to practice with, right? Do you want someone who is, I don't know, an intermediate Ojibwe speaker to be able to listen to a story and get practice at hearing spoken Ojibwe? That's a good thing you could create. Maybe you want this to be sort of oral histories about people's lives that you could give to their families in the future, right? Maybe someday someone's grandchild will want to learn about their grandparents' life, and you could give them this recording. You could make a dictionary out of your recordings. You could make collections of recipes or songs or medical practices or whatever else. Or you could just generally have some records in an archive for future safekeeping for you're not sure what purpose, but you want it to be there just in case you need it. And again, you could also sort of make cool, fun stuff for people to enjoy without any really serious learning purpose, which is also a great and valid thing to do. Maybe you just want to make music videos to put on YouTube. Great, do it. And so, one of the questions people often have about documentation, when I say things like document everything, it's all good, is documentation just about turning on a recorder, gathering a bunch of stuff, putting it in a file somewhere, and just leaving it? Well, no, ideally, you're going to do more than that, right? It's not just about having a bunch of recordings that sit there with no information about them. But it really helps when your documentation includes some additional information that you add to it, right? And if I want to put this in academic terms, documentation as a field is about the relationships between language data and their annotation. And when I say annotation, what I really mean is the information you add to these recordings, the ways that you make sense of these recordings, right? There's a big difference between just an audio file of somebody saying a bunch of words, and then also maybe something you write down about how each word is used and what it means and who said it and why did they make this recording, right? It's about adding some additional context to these recordings. And in coming weeks, we will learn how to do that kind of annotation with the things you've recorded. And again, products that you might come away with would include like dictionaries, maybe some videos with subtitles on them. We can talk about how to make those. and then more linguistic-y, researchy things if you want to go down that path, optionally. But again, the things you create could be nearly infinite. Get creative. And if you have questions like, I have an idea, is this a good idea for documentation? Just ask. We will be happy to talk about it with you. But I also want to say that documentation isn't just about what you finish doing and produce in the end, right? It's not just about the products you make. It's really also about the process of doing this documentation. And it's really important to do the documentation in a respectful, ethical, good way. Because in doing this documentation work, one of the outcomes is you can really elevate and honor the knowledge of the people who are keeping this language. You're showing interest in knowledge that people have, and that can be very meaningful to them. And similarly, doing this work of documentation can kind of increase prestige around a language. Sometimes people have this idea that, like, if you have a dictionary, your language is more real than a language that doesn't. And so, even though that's a very specific way to look at language, doing this work can add honor or respect to a language sometimes. And really importantly, doing documentation work can build your own relationships within the community, right? Documentation involves spending a lot of time talking to people, spending time with them, learning from them. And if you can build and improve your relationships with other folks in the community, that's a great outcome. And if you're documenting your own language, it can also be a really important learning process for you. You can learn a lot about who you are and who your community is and where you come from and all sorts of other things. So I just want to say that as you're doing this work, don't have a super narrow focus on what you're going to produce. Also be aware of how you're doing it and your relationships with the people that you're working with and what you are learning in the process. Yeah. One more ethical note. When I say that we need to do this work in ethical, respectful, and good ways, this is something that comes up all the time. Somebody will ask, like, what if someone doesn't want to share a word with me? Should I just get it anyway? No, no, oh God, no, right? Never, ever record things that are not okay to record. This seems like it should be obvious, but sometimes it's not. It's important to always respect the preferences of the people you're working with. If they say, please turn off the recorder for this part, turn off the recorder. If they say, no, I don't really want to work with you, don't pressure them. Just respect that no. And if someone says, I'm going to tell you this story, but it's important that it not be shared with this person, or that it not be shared for the next 30 years, or that it not be shared in summertime, always, always, always respect and honor those preferences. Don't share any knowledge that you are not authorized to share. Don't record things you are not authorized to record. Even if you're saying to yourself, oh no, if I don't record this now, it could be lost forever. If someone doesn't want to share it with you, that is too bad. That is their right. So don't push it. And we can talk more about this. There are always questions about that part too. So no stupid questions, please ask. And I'll share these readings as well on the topic of ethics in language documentation. And so as we are nearing the end of this component of the introductory session, some of you might be asking, well, what about language revitalization? And the answer is, it's really important and really good. And it's also outside the scope of this webinar. So this webinar is going to be about documentation, which is making these records of a language. But I want to say that documentation can be a really important foundation for future revitalization work, and it can also contribute to revitalization work that's happening right now. So it's really good to have good records of a language as a sort of a safety net. If God forbid someday there aren't any other speakers of your language, at least you have a lot of recordings that you can learn from and work with. And even if you have lots of speakers today, the recordings you make can be used for learning resources, for promotional activities, for fun, for bringing language into people's lives. And so really the difference we're looking at here is documentation is about making these records. And revitalization is about creating speakers of a language. It's about creating use of a language in people's lives. And one last thing, sometimes a question I get is, can I only document my language if it's endangered? And the answer is no, of course not. Even if your language is pretty strong, even if people are using it all the time and children are learning it, it might still need documentation, right? If your language isn't English, Mandarin, Arabic, French, German, Spanish, Russian, Japanese, or Korean, like the big, big, big languages, then your language probably needs more documentation. There's nothing wrong with making additional recordings of your language to use for whatever purpose you want. And maybe you're at a point where you really want there to be a Wikipedia in your language. You want there to be TV shows in your language. You want a Facebook interface in your language, right? These are all goals that you can do or support through language documentation as well. And so overall, in general, language documentation can really be a service to your language and your community, right? You can help people learn and retain and support your language through doing this kind of documentation. And so over the next 8 or 9 weeks, we're going to work together to get you started in the process of language documentation so that you can start your own projects and start thinking about how to keep your language safe in whatever way you want to. And now I'm really excited to answer some questions. So if y'all would like to ask questions on video or audio, just raise your hand or yeah, and I'll take questions from y'all. And in the meantime, I will look through the chat. All right, so looking through the chat. So questions after this session, will there be access to the presentation? Yes, so all these recordings will go on ELP's YouTube channel. I will drop a link to that in the chat. And you can also see last year's sessions there. And I see another question. I want to know how to show people the importance of knowing your heritage language. Most of the times they say, I prefer a language I can use to make money. Yeah, this is a question that probably resonates with a lot of you. How do you get people to care about language maintenance? That's a tough one. It really depends on your community and what people value. But I think a useful thing to highlight in every case is that learning the dominant language or the economically powerful language or whatever doesn't mean you have to give up your language. You can have them both, right? Sometimes people have this idea that speaking more than one language makes you worse at each language. In fancy terms, this might be called subtractive multilingualism, right? Like you can only be good at one language, and if you divide that into multiple languages, you get worse at each of them. Linguistically speaking, this isn't true. There are lots of people who are perfectly fluent in multiple languages and it doesn't cause them any problems. So if you're trying to talk to folks in your community, you might try and see if they have this idea that they can only have one good language. And then tell them it's okay, you actually can be strong in more than one language. You don't have to give up your language to learn the dominant one. You can have both. But I'm also happy to talk more about this sort of awareness and attitude question, Jason. Let's see. So another question, is there language endangerment when different communities have different dialects and words for objects? Great question. Hard to say, right? It's really, really normal for there to be different dialects of a language. In fact, pretty much every language has some differences between how people talk. Does that mean that there's language endangerment? No, there are so many kinds of English, and English is not at all endangered. But it could be the case that one of those dialects is more endangered than the others, right? Maybe everybody's speaking American English, but not that many people are speaking, I don't know, some smaller variety of like Ulster UK English anymore. You can have one endangered dialect, but having different dialects doesn't mean your language is endangered. Jason also asks, would it be the same process of documentation for a dormant language? Ooh, good question. This is a tough one. So, a dormant language is one that nobody who's still alive can speak fluently, right? And so, when you're dealing with a dormant language, you really can't go to a fluent speaker and record them. There's nobody to go record. And so when you have a dormant language, one thing you can do, if there is documentation from the past, right? If somebody made recordings 50 years ago, what you'll probably want to do is find those recordings and start learning from them and studying those. And there are programs that will actually help you find those old recordings and use them. One of them is called the National Breath of Life, if you are from the United States. So I will drop a link to that program in the chat here. Even if you're not in the US, you might find some inspiration in learning about how to work with archive materials for dormant languages. And then I see a question, what's the best way to incentivize people to document their language? Great question, Anthony. It really depends on your community and what people care about. So in some places saying, let's keep our language strong, it's endangered, we don't want to lose it, that would really motivate people, right? That if you scare people a little bit, sometimes they'll really get motivated. Some places people don't care so much. And what they really want is to have a better life for themselves and their family and their community. And so one way to incentivize people can be funding, but there's not a lot of it out there. Another way is to make it fun, to tie language documentation in with something else that people really want to be doing. So maybe nobody is going to be excited to just get together on Wednesdays and document language. Maybe that sounds kind of boring to them. But if it's like bingo night where you're also recording language, or we're going to do some language recording at the soccer match or whatever, sorry, football, because most of us aren't Americans, right? Sometimes tying in language work with things that people already enjoy and are enthusiastic about can be really good. Anthony, if you want to talk more about your specific community or your situation, happy to do that. And then I also see some others. Text asks what changes their mind about sharing a recording. So you recorded it, you published it somewhere, and then they came back and wanted it removed. Yeah, this is not uncommon in my ethic framework forever and ever. So if there is any way to unpublish what they are asking me to remove, I would just do that. I would always give people the ultimate control over what happens to recordings of them. I think that's a pretty solid ethical guideline, very much in line with principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. You should always assume that recordings belong to the people and communities they came from, not to you, even if you worked really hard to record them. But again, that's a pretty complicated topic that we can talk more about. I see another question. So somebody wanted to share a story about farms he inherited from his father and wants his children and grandchildren to get the story. He wants me to do it privately and not share the recording. So how do I do this? Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually not an uncommon situation either, that people have specific wishes for what they want to happen to a recording. And most archives, most professional language archives, will let you set specific conditions for how a language recording can be shared. So you can tell the archive, not the public can't see this, please, but these specific people can see this. So you can even specify down to the level of individual people who are allowed to access a recording at most good archives. So Jabrilla, I think if you work with a dedicated language archive, they should be able to accommodate that. Yeah. Vicky asks, is there a way to get these materials without Facebook? Yeah, I will start a Google Drive folder that y'all can just download things from without having a Facebook account. I know not everybody wants that. I see from Emily, I want to sing my favorite songs in my language and read Harry Potter in my language. Yes, awesome. You can totally do these things. There are a lot of really neat initiatives to translate pop culture into indigenous and endangered languages. There's a Harry Potter in Hawaiian. You could make your own Harry Potter translation. Sounds awesome. Will we actually do some documentation through the course? Yeah, good question. So we encourage you all to work on your own documentation projects as we are going through this course. So next week, we're going to be talking about how to make recordings. And we will encourage you to take that knowledge and go actually make some recordings. And then the following week, when we talk about sound systems, we'll encourage you to do some exercises about your language's sound systems. So it's not as in-depth as, a full documentation workshop or course. This is just sort of a basic introduction, but we do encourage y'all to work on your own documentation projects and ask questions about them here. I see, Renard, your hand's up, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Yeah, it's correct. I was wondering, one thing that I've been thinking, because I've never do a real language documentation. I've been trained, but I think I'm in initial stage, and the main challenging is I wouldn't say funding, but that's something that I need to consider. And I plan to look for funding. I was wondering whether in this webinar there's a specific session where you can give a training or perspective about how to build a good funding proposal for language documentation. But yeah, that's the number one. And other thing I want to ask is that in case of training, because I plan to do language documentation for my own language, do you prefer for us to train the community to involve in transcription and annotation, blah, blah, blah first, or we can do that later? I was kind of confused about that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first question, actually, I'll start with the second question for training the community. It really depends on who you're working with, what people's access to technology that would be needed for transcription, right? Is there already a writing system everyone knows or not? If not, that might take a while to get people transcribing if there's not a writing system everyone knows. One option to really involve people more quickly is to use a method called basic oral language documentation that doesn't require any kind of transcription or writing things down. So this is a really good solution if there's not a writing system everyone's already using. I will see if I can find a link to basic oral language documentation. There we go. Yeah, here we go. So this is a free open access paper on basic oral language documentation. And I will put this in the Google Drive as well. But as far as support for writing language documentation funding proposals, that is something that you'd probably want some one-on-one support with. And luckily, ELP has folks to help you with that. So I'm going to send a link to the Endangered Languages Project's Revitalization Mentors program. If you click there, you can make a free appointment to talk with folks who have experience and expertise in language documentation and revitalization. And one of the mentors, Dr. Payasakumbu, has success writing grants to ELDP and a lot of other major documentation funders. He's really good at grant applications, so I think he'd be a perfect person to support you with that. Yeah, so you can make a free appointment to talk with him anytime and get some support on your documentation work. Yeah, I hope I answered all your questions. And if not, y'all are welcome to email me anytime with additional questions. I'm just scanning the chat here. Yeah, but actually, Miki, I see your hand up, so go ahead and ask your question while I'm looking at the rest of this. And in the meantime, I'm just dropping some things in the chat. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Good evening. Uh, I just wanted to know and ask a question: the relationship between language documentation and writing system, because the problem we are facing in my language, for example, is the writing system. The writing system, in accordance with IPA chart or indigenous alphabet, is not accepted by the community, by the population. Now, how can we manage in order to document our language? In our community, for example, yes, a community, the writing system proposed by linguists and other people working to document the language is not accepted by the community. Now, what are we supposed to do? Thank you.
Great question. Yeah. I think this is probably a question that might be familiar to a lot of people because it is so hard to get a community to agree on a writing system. Linguists even talk about orthography wars pretty often. People get really heated about which writing system to use. And so the thing about documentation is you can work mostly in audio and video, right? You don't necessarily need to transcribe anything or write anything down to do good documentation. So you can kind of just avoid the issue altogether so that you don't, make anyone mad or cause community tensions. But another thing you can do is just work in some very outside system like IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, when you're doing your transcriptions, and just don't expect anyone in the community to use those transcriptions. You can just do it for yourself. And then when you're starting to create language materials, you can either choose the most popular writing system that most people in the community are using. But of course, you'll have to navigate like the political outcomes of that, right? You might make some people mad. You might lose some friendships.
But the,
Um,
but the problem,
yeah.
the problem is that the community is using the French writing system, which does not favor all the song of the language, all the sound of the language. That's the big problem now. Instead, even if we are adapting, we are trying to adapt ourselves. For example, contour, tone, modulated sound in our language. We double the vowel instead of making a diacritic mark, but it is still difficult. It is still difficult. So thank you for your answer. I think I will adapt. I would prefer now recording than writing. Thank you.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if people are using a lot of different writing systems, there are some linguists who strongly advise just let people write how they want to, right? It doesn't actually matter as long as everyone understands each other. It's kind of like I speak a little bit differently than people in the UK, but we understand each other. Like they spell neighbor with a U and I don't, and it doesn't matter. I understand what they're saying. So if you're not trying to do like computational stuff, just let people have their different ways of writing as long as everyone can understand it. Yeah, but it's rarely that simple. Yeah. Just looking at the other chat. All right. So someone asked, will we shed some light on softwares used for language documentation? Yes, we will. So Akao will be leading a session on Elan, which is one of the big ones used for documentation in week 7. So come to that one if you're interested in softwares. Let's see. Can you give us more insights about making didactic materials with documentation data? Great question. That would be one of the more complicated topics to work on, but it depends on what kind of materials you're trying to make. And so if you're interested in making, say, talking dictionaries, we can go over how to do that in a future week. If you're interested in making like textbooks for kids, that is significantly more complicated. I would also suggest making an appointment with some of the revitalization mentors to talk about creating educational materials. So Yasmin Novello, one of the mentors, has some experience creating educational materials. So does Pius Ikumbu. I would say they are awesome people to get personalized insight from on that. Ruben, for your language context, maybe you can explain a little bit more what kind of documentation you have and what kind of materials you're hoping to make, and we can give you some thoughts. All right, sorry, just skimming the chat here. Want to pursue higher education on language documentation. I'm from Bangladesh. Should I pursue a second MA there and work on Bangladesh's endangered languages, or do I have to work on endangered languages of the US? What are the funding possibilities? Great question. You definitely do not have to work on endangered languages in the US, even if you're at a US university, right? I went to a US university and I worked on languages in Cameroon, but it is true that it is somewhat harder to get funding for documentation in other parts of the world. And that is just a crappy reality. So if you have questions about specific funding possibilities or where to find scholarships and all that, we're working on a resource showing funding sources, and ELP's social media regularly posts things like grants and scholarships. So keep an eye on our social media. And if you have questions for your own academic path, feel free to email me. I will see if I can give you any advice. But let's see, some more general questions. Oh, I see a hand up. Go ahead.
Hello. My question is, in the case where I want to
I think maybe we lost your internet. Oh, okay, I can't hear you anymore, but if you come back, feel free to answer or to ask your question. I'm just going to keep answering chat questions for now. See a question here. How can we encourage people to promote their language with the rampant movement of people from rural areas to urban areas, especially for us here in Cameroon? Great question. Yeah, this is something that's happening pretty much all over the world, is people moving from rural areas to cities. It's called the rural exodus. And it is really hard to keep your language strong when you move from maybe a town where everyone speaks your language to a city where you are one among 500 different languages, right? One thing that has been pretty successful and that keeps languages strong historically, at least in Cameroon and maybe nearby countries, is sending kids home to the village for holidays as much as possible. So if you can, send your kids to go stay with their grandparents, their aunties, their uncles, send them to the village for summer holidays so that they can learn and use language. Another thing would be, if, again, since this is a question for Cameroon, do your Njangi meetings in language if you can. Like, just make sure there is a regular meeting space where people can use the language in the city. If you have like an association for folks from your village or from your language, do those meetings as often as possible and try and be pretty serious about using language in those meetings. Really, the key to keeping a language strong is just making sure people have opportunities to use it in their daily lives, opportunities to learn it, opportunities to keep it active in their minds and in their lives. So whatever you can do towards that end, it's a great thing to do. Let's see. Is it possible to document a language you don't speak? Yes, definitely. That is unfortunately how a lot of language documentation is done, right? By people who don't know that language. It's obviously way better and easier and smoother to document a language you do know. But if you have a shared language with the people who speak what you're trying to document, you can work around it, right? I don't speak Iasa. I managed to document some Iasa using French with Iasa speakers. So it's very, very possible. Again, there are extra tricky ethical issues to consider when you're working with a community that's not your own. You want to make sure that you are doing it respectfully, that you're doing it ethically, that you're building good relationships. So my colleague Amanda Holmes and I released this Linguists Code of Conduct a few earlier this year, I guess. And it's just sort of a set of questions to think about when you are working with communities other than your own community, and how to do that in a respectful way. I see a question. Do we use Fieldwork Language Explorer software? Yeah, a lot of people find Flex is the name of the software very useful for sort of keeping track of their language data. It's also, Flex is limited in that you can only use it on a Windows computer, and it is not very easy to move data from Flex into other programs. It takes a little bit of technical knowledge, but lots of people use it. There are good tutorials out there. And I also see a question, how do you document the language when you don't speak it or speak the dominant language? Ooh, so let's say you have no shared language between you and the people who speak the language. You're in for a little bit of a challenge there, but it is possible. There are techniques for monolingual field work, and that is a general term for when you pretty much start as if you are a tiny baby who doesn't know how to speak, and you just point to stuff and you're like, and somebody will tell you a word for cup, and you just hold up a pen and somebody will tell you a word for pen, and it goes slower and it's challenging, but it's absolutely a way to do language documentation. I'll try and remember to send some resources about monolingual documentation too. And let's see, is there a list of upcoming speakers and topics? Yes, I will share the schedule as soon as we hang up. Next week, we are going to be learning about making recordings, both audio and video recordings. I will share that schedule with y'all. And I see this question. So my native language isn't spoken, but our dialect of Spanish has a lot of words from that language. So how can I document that hidden language? Great question. How do you sort of be a detective and pull your language out through the words that it's left in Spanish? That is maybe too complicated a question for me to answer right now in this Zoom call. So Jason, if you wouldn't mind just like emailing me, and I will try and point you to some resources there. And let's see. Yeah, Gail says we sometimes have a bit of a problem with dialects, like which one should be taught. This can be really complicated. Sometimes maybe the dialect that has more speakers is the ones that end up getting taught in school or getting the textbooks or whatever, and that can cause some bad feelings with people who speak other dialects. There are lots of different ways to address this. Yeah, in a perfect world, everybody would be able to use their own dialect, but there are some good resources out there for how to encourage people to accept dialectal variation. I'll put some of those in the drive too. Madeline says, I'd like to touch base with the mentors. Awesome, please do. And I will also put that link to the mentors program in the chat again. I encourage all of y'all to get in touch with them. They are all wonderful people with deep knowledge of language endangerment and documentation and revitalization. You're also welcome to email me. And I see one more question. I usually have some challenges on video subtitling. Can you help us with this? Yes. Akao, since you're going to be teaching the session on Elan, maybe we could include in that session just a brief thing about how to use Elan transcripts for video subtitles. Where can we find info about internships in language documentation for current students or recent grads? Great question. ELP generally posts opportunities that we find on our social media and in our regular newsletter. I will put a There are also often job and scholarship opportunities posted on the Linguist list. If you are not familiar with that, it is sort of a big mailing list and database for opportunities in linguistics. So there is that. And I will also provide my email address if you would like to get in touch with any more questions going forward. So there it is in the chat. And here is the sign up for the ELP newsletter if you would like to do that. All right. And I see one more comment from Ruben. So I speak Nahuatl. Okay, I work with Nahuatl. My target is children in high school for educational materials. And students pay more attention, are more interested in the variant only spoken by old people from those communities. Aha. So like the young folks are really most interested in learning about the kinds of Nahuatl most spoken by older people. Is that what you mean? This sounds like a really interesting context. Yeah, so actually, it would be wonderful, Ruben, if you wanted to email. There are a few papers coming to mind that deal with this, so maybe we could have a chat about it. Okay, so you're working on Central American Nahuatl, and most people want to use the TL. What is the TL? Is that a different variety of Nahuatl? Yeah. But either way, this sounds like a complex and fascinating discussion. So please email me and we will continue talking about it. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So as you may have noticed, my answers to a lot of these questions were, wow, that's complicated. Let's talk about it more individually. I think you will all find in your own language documentation work that you come across a lot of really complicated things that have no simple answer. And the best part about all of us being together online is that we can discuss them with each other and we can learn from each other's experiences. So if you have questions that you're not finding satisfying answers to, please join us in the Facebook group and post your questions and see what everyone else has to say from their own experiences in documenting their languages. I will drop the chat to that Facebook group. Here you go. And if you're not on Facebook, again, email me, make an appointment with the revitalization mentors. There are people here at ELP who are really excited to support you in your language work, whatever you're working on. So contact us. We're here to help. That's what we're here for. And next week, if there aren't any more questions, we will be meeting at the same time next Friday and learning about audio and video recording. And you don't need fancy microphones or fancy video cameras. Even if you just have a cell phone, great. We're going to talk about how to make good recordings with your cell phone. So thank you everybody for being here. It was a real pleasure to talk with you today. Thanks for your awesome questions. And we will post this recording on our YouTube and see you next week. Same time, same Zoom room. Take care, everybody. Have a good day or evening or whatever time it is where you are. All right. Bye, folks. Oh, it's so nice to see some faces as we're hanging out. Bye, everybody.
Akeva.
Akeva.